This is Where Did the Road Go? Our aim is to explore the fringe, to be true skeptics and question openly, to investigate the paranormal, bring light to the dark corners of history, and give a voice to the shunned of science. We deal in mystery and the important questions that these subjects bring to light. What is reality? Who are we? And why are we here? Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com for a full show archive, links to all our social media, upcoming schedule, and much, much more. Now, join your host Soraya on this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And welcome to tonight's show. Tonight we're going to be talking with Steph Young, and Steph has written quite a few books on everything from angels and near-death experiences to weird disappearances and killings, murders. For the most part, we will be discussing her latest book, Something in the Woods is Taking People. This is available on Amazon as a Kindle book. It's short, it is packed full of information, and it is a very entertaining read. It's also only about $3, so well worth checking out. So, this interview was pre-recorded earlier today due to the fact that Steph is in the UK, so I can't take any questions in the chat room this week, but next week we will have Peter Robbins, who was initially going to be this week, so that's going to be next week due to some weather issues here. And the week after that is the Beyond the Realm conference at the Ramada Inn here in Ithaca. That's February 28th. There's stuff going on all day, and I'll be part of a roundtable discussion from 5 to 7 o'clock, along with Peter Canellis of the Ghost Hunters of the Finger Lakes, Sharon Cole of the Farley Rolling Hills Asylum, Luke St. Clair of Ithaca University, who did a follow-along with the Ghost Hunters of the Finger Lakes, creating a documentary for them, Katie Christopher from TV's Ghost Detectives, and author of Paranormal Oddities and Government Conspiracies. And after that, for the show that night, many, if not all of them, are going to be coming up, and we're going to be participating in sort of a group conversation about the paranormal. And Lorna Reynolds, who's been here with Ghost Hunters of the Finger Lakes, is putting it on, and she will be coming up as well. So it should be kind of a weird, who knows where it's going to go sort of night. On the 14th, I have Aaron Gullius and Mike Clellan back as we continue our exploration of the history of the UFO phenomena. And I have a bunch of other very interesting interviews coming up for you in March and April, and hopefully beyond that. All right, with no more further ado, here's Steph Young. So welcome to the show, Steph.
Hi.
And we're talking to you from London?
Yes, you are.
Okay, and to clarify for people, the books are written as Stephen Young, but you're actually, your name is Steph.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so you also write under a different name as well?
Yep, Tessie Rawlins.
And that stuff is a little more lighthearted than what we're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah, near-death experiences, heaven, angels, all the nice things.
And under Stephen Young, you write about the darker sides of things.
I do, yes. Missing people, demons, that kind of thing.
All right. And your latest book is entitled Something in the Woods. And this is what you do is you have fairly short books, but there's so much information you've condensed down into here. It's really fun to read, and it zips right along.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to put as much factual information in without lots of fluff and padding. So it's a fast read, but it is jam-packed with information. Yeah.
And there's a lot of this stuff I've heard of here or there, but there are a bunch of things I had never heard of that you talk about. You cover some of the ground that David Paulides talks about here and there, but not anywhere near as much as I had expected, with the subject of the book being missing people in the woods and things like that. Yeah. I assume you have followed David's work as well.
Well, I have found it. Yes, I have. Actually, I started writing the book as well as the mysterious things in the woods. That was the first one. I started writing those after I'd finished a time travel book, And it led into these books because I'd been reading about people going missing, possibly disappearing into dimensions or vortexes or along ley lines and near granite rocks. So it kind of, first of all, I was looking at what could be causing it, whether it was a geometric kind of effect from the granite, or whether people were disappearing to actual altered realities or time slips. So I was looking in forests and woods for that, and I was coming across more and more people that were missing, and then they were turning up months later or weeks later dead, and that kind of led me into looking more to the missing side, and that's what led me into those books. But yeah, I mean, I've had lots of emails saying, oh, have you read David Pauley? And I said, well, yeah, I haven't actually read them because I don't have time, but I've certainly heard him, and it's fascinating, the research that he's done. Yeah, absolutely.
And like I said, you touch on it in here. You kind of overlap a little into his work, but it's very different stuff you're dealing with here. One of the things you touch on that I had not heard of was the smiley face killer. Do you want to tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it has been something that was quite widespread in the news back in the sort of 2008 time, I think it was. But it's sort of died down now, and initially it started, there was a journalist called Christy Peel, and she had found out about these college-age boys going missing and turning up dead in pools of water or water by universities. And then she was contacted by two retired New York police detectives who had heard about her cases and said, actually, we've got about 40 that we're looking into. And they got together and started working out. The two detectives also were working with a professor of criminology called Professor Gilbertson, who's at Wisconsin, La Crosse University. And he specializes in gang stalking. So that's probably what drew him into it. And it does seem to be, it's mostly in the Midwest, but there's possibly up to 100 college-age boys. It's always the same type, very fit, athletic, usually on swim teams. And they go missing, then they're found maybe a week later, could be up to 3 or 4 weeks later. And the professor was saying, this is an organized gang. It's not college-age boys going out drinking, getting drunk, wandering off and falling in. Although, that could be the case for some people. But, I've talked about this in the past, and, I went to university in a seaside town right by the sea. Nobody ever drowned there. We don't have that happening in England. However, there is now 65 deaths in Manchester. So there is a tie-in. It could be happening here as well. Manchester is a university town in England. But going back to those cases, there's some really strange things. The journalist herself, she got in touch with a forensic pathologist, and he talked about some of the cases. And for example, there's one boy called Chris Jenkins, and he was on the University of Minnesota swim team, and he disappeared, and he was found 4 months later, and the police said, well, he just fell in. But his hands were folded over his chest, and he was encased in a block of ice because it was winter. But it was just not consistent with a drowning. And another boy, Jared Dion, in 2004, he was found 5 days after he went missing, and he was an athlete, he was a swimmer. But the coroner ruled that he'd definitely been moved before his death, and he'd only been dead 3 days, so he'd been alive for 2 days. But where had he been? Had he been kept somewhere? And another boy, 2005, Todd Geeb, he was found in a remote bed of stagnant water, so it's not somewhere really that a body would flow to. And again, he'd been missing for 3 weeks, but the autopsy said he's only been dead for 2 or 5 days. And the detectives and the professor were saying, well, look, he's been kept somewhere. These people are being abducted, and there is a kind of possibility, perhaps, that maybe they're being drugged and taken, and some kind of organised gang is doing this. Another boy was found, and it was ruled by an independent pathologist afterwards that he had no water in his lungs, so he hadn't drowned in the water, and he had. When somebody decomposes, that you get larvae sometimes that sort of goes there, and it was an indoor kind of larvae, so he definitely wasn't outside for all the time that he was missing. And actually, I mean, I've been talking to people quite recently on the internet, and these cases have continued, so they definitely haven't been stopping. And I mean, it's a bit hard, to talk to people, but I was contacted by one of the sisters recently, and there's no kind of explanation as to how and why these things keep happening. But in the Wisconsin area, I don't know, I mentioned on another show that there's a possibility that it is a cult kind of killing. There was a man called James Downard years ago who pointed out that there's some kind of synchronistic pattern to things, and also that there's a possibility in the occult circle that people operate a killing of the king's ritual, which is sort of at the moment of death, the power of that person is passed in a ritual to the person who's doing it. So there's a few theories out there. Some are saying it's a gang of organised elite, maybe. But something's definitely going on. I mean, there was a documentary recently a news channel did, but people say, well, it's just people getting drunk and drowning, but there's a lot of evidence that says no, there's something going on here. So, I think it is quite an important thing to keep looking at.
And whatever's happening sounds like the people are organized. Otherwise, there would be an easy trail of evidence.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there is no evidence at all. To me, it's a book in itself, and I was kind of considering doing that because there is so much going on. And there is never any evidence, but it's always people that have been thrown out of bars, and you could say, well, it's because they're drunk, but I'm not quite sure why they get thrown out with their keys, any ability to get home, and things like that. So as I say, there's a lot that could be talked about with that case, really, but it's ongoing and it's very mysterious. And as I say now, because I was talking to the professor and he said, have you heard about the Manchester ones? And I said, well, I was looking at it last year and I wasn't quite sure, because we do have a slightly different culture here in London, in the UK, and it's a very heavy drinking culture. And there is a lot of drug taking, in young people and college-age people. So maybe it's slightly different. And the canals there, the thing is they're very remote. Although they run through the centre of the city, they're really not inviting places. They're very dark and dingy. They haven't been renovated. There's no CCTV cameras there, which is a shame. But they're not places that are a shortcut home. And there is a suggestion, okay, these people have taken drugs and they've fallen in, but it's an enormous number of people to have ended up that way. So, and a professor at a college in Birmingham, he accessed the Freedom of Information reports himself and said this is definitely not suicide cases because very few people use that method. So again, he thinks, well, there's something here that's not quite right. And the professor that I was talking to from the university in Wisconsin said, well, obviously clearly thinks there's some kind of link, which again, also I found something which was a bit strange, saying that the MK Ultra documents had been sent from that area in Wisconsin, and is there a link to, organised MK Ultra type mind control things? I don't know. I haven't, I've got a lot of research to do, really, to get to the bottom of that one, but very strange.
Huh. Yeah, and I don't know how I ever missed hearing about it, but there's so many cases there. And it doesn't seem like there's necessarily anything paranormal going on.
No, and in fact, what's really odd is that there was a retired forensic pathologist who lived in the Wisconsin area, and he actually made a documentary with a producer who made the Dark Knight Batman films, who offered his services for free because they thought something's happening here and we need to do a film about it. And he said, on the paranormal side of things, he said, the reason I made this film, I'm retired, but I had a visit from my dead father, and he said to me, you've got to look into this. And that's what prompted him to make the films. Well, he did make it. So, for example, they went out on the lake and they tried to do EVP recordings. All their batteries failed, so they went back again and did it did capture something. They said they captured screaming voices. I don't know about that. But so it's quite weird. But they couldn't find anything conclusive in terms of paranormal there. No, not at all. But then again, with paranormal, it's very hard to get the evidence, isn't it?
Well, true, but I mean, there are some things where you look at it and you can tell that there's probably a human agency involved. This seems like one of those things.
Yeah.
Whereas there are other cases where you're just going, what the hell happened here?
Yeah, yeah.
Another one that probably seems like it would probably have a human agency involved is the Highway of Tears. And this is off in Western Canada, correct?
Yeah, it's Highway 16, and it's a 500-kilometer road, and it's very remote, and it's just mountain drop views and forests. But since the 1960s, there's been at least 50 women. So in this case, it's women that have been going missing. It's still happening, and the Canadian police, they did arrest somebody in 2005 who was a serial killer. So he was charged with killing 9, and possibly he's caused more deaths as well. And there was also another serial killer, and but he was operating more in the city part of the area. But I mean, he killed, I think it was nearly 30 or 40 in horrific ways. But they kind of say that it didn't really come to public light because a lot of the victims going missing were young women, but they were from the indigenous Native American side, and nobody was really taking any notice until a white girl went missing, and then it kind of hit the headlines. But I mean, one woman is really spooky actually, because one woman she didn't have the best of lives, and she was hearing about all these murders, and she was actually writing in her journal, and she's saying, am I next? Is he watching me, and is he waiting, like a predator? And so kept this journal, and then she disappeared, and she ended up being one of the victims. So that was really sad. But the police have said, well, we know about those 2 serial killers, but we don't think that they did all of them. We do think it's probably human people doing this. There's no real supernatural kind of element to it. And it's always the same victim type as well. They're always found, quite near the roadside. The problem with that area is they have tried to improve the transport system more recently, but people used to hitch there all the time because there's so few transport options there, because it's such a long road and it's so remote that very often, girls would hitch a ride because they couldn't get from one place to another. So I think there's been a lot of lobbying to try and get the transport system better. But yeah, to me, that it really does seem to be some very bad serial type killer people out there doing it.
And there may be some word of mouth between the serial killers that this is a good place to take people as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a quote in the paper that I read actually, it was saying, you could just literally take somebody. There was no witnesses around for miles. You could just snatch somebody up, drive off, throw them off a cliff, nearby cliff. Nobody would see you. So it's the perfect killing ground, really. Yeah.
Wow. One of the more puzzling ones you talk about in the book is Eliza Lamb.
Yeah.
And if anyone has not seen the video, go to YouTube and look up Eliza Lamb, and it's ELISALAM. And the video, if you want to describe it a little bit to people, the case and the video, because this is one of those rare cases where we do have a video, and the video is really bizarre.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, she's a Canadian girl in her early 20s, and she took some time out of college and was just traveling around, and she ended up staying at the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so the video that you can see on YouTube, so she gets into the lift, and she presses all the buttons, and then she kind of gets out again, and she looks around in the corridor as though she's looking for someone. She gets back in the lift, and the lift doesn't start, and she starts to become increasingly anxious and a bit distressed. And some people say on the recording that you can see dark shadows, or you could even see possibly formation of a face in the walls on the recording. But you could also say, well, maybe it's just really poor video quality.
Which it is. It was just a closed circuit camera, if I
Yeah,
remember right.
and it's an old hotel, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
but she, she gets in and out of the lift, and one thing really strange that she does is she puts her hands up in front of her as though she's feeling for something or somebody. So you can't see anybody there, but she's trying to feel for who is there. And it's almost like, maybe somebody's talking to her, but you can't see them. So she's really, really distressed, and she's sort of, she's bending her knees and she's wrenching her hands together, like she's really doesn't know what's going on, and she's very confused and disoriented and worried, and then that's the end of the lift sequence that you can see. But she ended up in a water tower on the roof 2 weeks later. She's gone to the roof. 2 weeks later, the residents of the hotel are saying that the water tastes funny, and it turns out when they look in the water tower that she's in there naked and dead, and she's been in there for 2 weeks. So the really strange thing about it is, I suppose, why did she go up to the roof? And there is the suggestion that the roof entrance was locked. There was no ladder going up to the 15-foot water tower, supposedly. So how did she get up there and in there? If there was an alarmed as well, actually, supposed to be alarmed. But if she did manage to get up there herself, why on earth would she do that? There was no suggestion that she had any kind of mental illness. And so, she ends up there dead. But then, because it was such a strange case, there's been a lot of chatter about what was going on. And one thing that really struck me was I was listening to a radio show, which I do a lot, and I heard a channeler who is a Canadian man, and he's supposed to be the next Edgar Casey, who used to be able to channel and access the Akashic records, if you believe in that. And he could actually heal people, so he would have sessions with people, and he would diagnose their illnesses and help them heal. And so this man, Dr. James Cottrell, he's supposed to be able to do this, and he started doing it because his daughter was ill, and he wanted to try and cure her. So anyway, he discovered that he had these abilities, supposedly, and he also has a video on YouTube, which I found, and he's describing the Eliza Lamb case. And he says, well, he puts himself at the scene, almost like remote viewing it, and in his opinion, he says, well, in the lift, she was hearing voices, and these voices were being beamed at her head, and the voices were telling her to go up to the lift. They were luring her up there, and they were confusing her, but she wanted to follow where the voices were leading her to try and find the source of them. And then when she got to the roof, she was then being beamed with this kind of laser-type weapon, and it was giving her self-destructive thoughts. And he said he could see a figure on the roof, and the figure was either wearing a balaclava or was cloaked, and he was the one pointing the thing at her head, disorienting her, giving her these self-destruct thoughts. And he said, well, it could have been somebody physical, like a real person, or actually it could have been a discarnate entity. In other words, it could have been some kind of demonic, transdimensional entity, which all sounds really outlandish. But on the other hand, I've come across other cases where people say that they're being sent voices, or psychotronic weapons are being used. So maybe, but the kind of story has so many different angles to it, because for example, Aleister Crowley wrote a poem. He was staying in the Cecil Hotel, but in London, and he wrote a poem, and it was called Seela. Seela is an anagram for Eliza. And some of the words in the poem say, be seen in a high lonely tower. And the story of the poem is that there is a judge in it, and he willingly sacrifices his daughter. So again, that's a strange coincidence, I suppose, let's say. And also, I don't know if this was somebody trying to make it look like this was true or not. It's very difficult to know, but there were Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts which popped up, but they've disappeared. So I don't know if they were hers or not hers, but there was one account that's supposed to be hers, and she had, a few days prior to her disappearance, she had supposedly shared a tweet about a Canadian company that was getting funding from the Pentagram to develop cloaking technology to make In other words, make weapons, make soldiers invisible, which again sounds completely outlandish, but actually, if you look deeper into the research, some of these things are possible. But again, I don't know if that was somebody trying to make it look that way, and I don't know why they would be, or whether it was her. I don't know. And there was another thing about a TB outbreak. So shortly afterwards, they sent in a team in the area to use TB kind of vaccination, which is Lamb Elisa. So it's got the same name as hers. I looked into that, but I couldn't really find a connection because that had been in existence for quite a long time, I think, that actual vaccination. But
so it's just a weird coincidence.
I think that is. But, other people are saying, oh, this was all done deliberately. She was targeted, in other words. But it's a very fascinating, again, it's something that really, is a whole show or it's a whole book. It's fascinating. There are so many different angles, but it's very hard to know exactly. I mean, also a couple of serial killers lived at the hotel. It's got a very dodgy reputation. There's lots of suicides that have happened there. Again, it's a really hard to know. A very strange case. But,
and that there makes you wonder if the hotel is maybe sitting in a specific position that sensitive people have issues with, maybe.
Yeah, it does. And actually, because I'm working on a new book, sort of following up on all of these things, and I'm kind of halfway through. And yesterday, I was looking into ley lines, and what I discovered is that you can blacken ley lines. Now, it's kind of pseudoscience in a way, because it's very difficult, unless you're a dowser, you don't really have the ability to say where these ley lines are under the earth. But it's said that if you're an occult practitioner, you can blacken the ley lines. Okay, these are invisible lines, you can't see them, but if you use occult working, you can blacken them, which makes it a negative place, so it can have an effect on people. Again, it's very hard to prove that kind of thing, but what I was reading the last couple of days about it, trying to come up with evidence of it, is that you can kind of negatively influence a place, using the magnetic kind of field.
Right. And it's also possible that with serial killers and such being in the area, their energy may have rubbed off on the place for all we know.
Yeah, exactly. I remember the thing about the granite and having an effect on people. And when I was looking into that, I was coming up with places in wilderness areas where people were being some kind of compulsion to throw themselves off ledges. So there's a place called Assinet Ledge in Freetown. And there's been a lot of people, it's not a suicide spot, it's in the middle of a wilderness national park, but there's been about 18 suicides, and people have thrown themselves off in front of other people, but nobody's really gone there specifically with the intention of saying, I'm going to kill myself today. It's been as if they've felt this compulsion to do it. And another place I found was in New South Wales in Australia, and it's called Babinda Boulders, and there's a really high count of people saying, I felt compelled, and it's almost like I had to be pulled back from going off this ledge. So there are places that seem to hold some kind of negative intention or negative memory. Again, that's a really hard thing to prove, but there are a lot of places that seem to draw people to it. When I was doing a demon book, there was I'm going a bit off topic here, but there was a guy in London, and he went with his dad to a house, and he went up the stairs, and as he was going up, he felt something push him, and he got up to the second floor, and he saw a ledge that led, it was a balcony, and he walked onto it, and he heard this voice, and the voice said to him, just jump down, it's a couple of inches, you'll be absolutely fine. And he was about to jump, and his dad luckily was behind him and just pulled him back. And when his dad asked a friend of his, who was a British policeman, if he could access the records about the house and try and find out if there was anything there that could possibly be causing it, there was recorded 18 people had thrown themselves off that tower, off that ledge.
Wow.
And it was just an ordinary suburban house. So it's an extraordinarily high number of people to do that.
Yeah. But I also wonder if maybe it's just some kind of field, some kind of electrical field, magnetic field, vibration that we can't necessarily detect very easily that affects us in a negative way. Not necessarily that negative energy has been stored there, but it's just not, it doesn't connect with us in a necessarily positive way.
Mm, mm. Well, yeah, I think that's true, and it's a bit like I was saying about the ley lines. I mean, yesterday I haven't finished researching it properly, but there was a Druid site, and they go around looking at these blackened ley lines, and this man was doing an experiment because it was an accident black spot, so it was in the middle of the countryside, and there was a road where people always kept having car accidents, but it wasn't a particularly bad road to be on, so there was no actual formation in the road, like a blind corner that would really lead you to have an accident. And he'd been there dowsing and said that the lines were intersecting and it was causing this really bad energy. And he wondered if it could be cleared. So he was carrying out this experiment to try and do it. Again, as I say, it's like kind of seen as a pseudoscience. It's not really something that, a university professor would study necessarily, but
Right.
But people have done a lot of work on that side of things.
Yeah, yeah. And Paul Devereaux has shown how UFO sightings tend to pop up along fault lines in the Earth as well, and some of those fault lines line up with some of the ley lines.
Oh, really? Well, I can't remember the guy's name, but this was yesterday when I was looking at it, and he'd done a study. He's been studying for about 25 years. Michel Gibbons, I think his name was, and he's been doing this study, and what he found about these ley line things again was that 95% of the alleged sightings that he'd reported of UFO abductions had happened on these blackened ley lines, but the contactee experiences, this is in England only, but the contactee experiences he'd discovered and investigated had happened on positive lines. So the people that had had these experiences had said this was really pleasant, and I enjoyed it, but the ones that had had the awful experiences were on these other ones.
Well, a factor there too could be if the UFO abduction experience has more to do with altered states. Depending on what puts you in that altered state might depend on how your experience goes. Almost like a bad trip if you go into if you're getting brought into it through a negative energy area.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the other stories you talk about that I found really interesting in this book is that of Devin Williams.
Yeah, he was a trucker. He'd been doing it for years and years, and in '95. He left his home in Kansas with his 18-wheeler, fully loaded, and he was on his way to Arizona. And when he reached, it was around Interstate 40, and he was passing a remote forest road, and it was at Buck Springs area in the national park. And for some reason, he took a detour and he drove down this road, and it was almost like a cattle road. It was not a road fit for traffic. And as he got to the end of it, obviously he couldn't go any further. The road kind of ended and the forest began, and so he got stuck and he got out of the truck. And he was walking around, and some hikers saw him, and he was behaving really erratically, and he was talking to trees, and he was barefoot and really disoriented. And they went up to him and they said, "What's the matter? Why have you driven up here?" And he just said, "Well, I didn't. They did it," pointing at his truck. And they kind of left him to it, and then he just vanished, disappeared without trace. And the searchers were called in with, tracker dogs, canines, but they couldn't find any trace of him. And then 2 years later, his skull was found on a place called Mogollon Rim, which is only about a quarter of a mile away. But I suppose the question is, where had he been all that time? I don't know if he was in the area all that time, but his boss said, we used to regularly drug test people as part of their job, so he wasn't on drugs, he had a happy family life, and, they can't understand why he did what he did, and, they say, well, what were the voices? And so some people think, well, maybe it was kind of aliens influencing him, but I don't know. I mean, I kind of think about the voice technology, but then it's a bit bizarre to suddenly target somebody, in the middle of nowhere in a truck? Or was it something that we just don't know? It's a very strange case.
Yeah, and what strikes me about it now, what was the cause of death for him?
Well, I mean, they really only found his skull 2 years later, so it was
Right,
it was
okay.
impossible really to know.
Because David Paulides, when he talks about a lot of his stories, there are numerous cases where people abandon their vehicles, and so many of them are found barefoot.
Right.
And two of those elements are right there. He just drove his truck up the path and stopped it and left all his stuff and got out barefoot for whatever reason and disappeared into the woods.
Yeah, I mean, it did seem, from what I was reading, that he didn't lose his shoes, but he had already taken them off. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they said he had a hat that he absolutely loved, and he would go nowhere without it. But he didn't take that with him. But he was just thoroughly confused, and as if he didn't know where on earth he was. But as to why, it's completely mysterious. It really is.
Yeah.
And there was a case of 3 men, actually, in the Liberty County in Texas. And 2 of those men, 3 of them disappeared in the space of a couple of weeks. And 2 of those men both abandoned their cars at the side of the road, keys still in it, all their money inside, and just got out and disappeared. I mean, one of them was Mark Weinberger, and he actually, before he did that, he'd gone to 2 garages, and he said, "I'm being chased." But they couldn't really get any sense out of him. And then the next thing you know, he's just left his car and abandoned it. And so did another guy, Elwyn Rogers, but he was an older person, and he was a Vietnam vet, and he'd had injuries to his feet, so he couldn't really walk very far. But all they found was Mark Weinberger. They just found a coat of his in a remote gravel pit. But they don't know where on earth these 2 went. And there was another man at the same time called Dennis Rogers, and he was older again, and he was out on just a regular daily short walk, and he had his phone with him, but he disappeared, and they traced his phone to inside a swamp, and they found footprints, and the footprints were going round in a circle, but then they just stopped, and he disappeared. Now, he had had a stroke, so he did have short-term memory loss, which possibly could account for his getting lost. Don't know why he would go around in a circle like that, but he completely disappeared as well, and there was no trace, and they haven't found him. But amazingly, I think there's 40 people so far missing in Liberty and Montgomery counties, so it's quite a lot of people,
Yeah, and it also strikes me again with Paulides. There was a case, I talked to him the last time I had him on, if anyone's interested. I think it was the last case he talked about, where this man had called his friends, his wife, and said he was being chased by people. And it was a very strange case. They recently put a newspaper article up kind of dismissing and glossing over the weirdness of the case with all the death results and stuff. But it was another case where he just sort of lost it and was leaving confused messages and telling people that people were chasing him. And there's no evidence that anyone was actually chasing him.
Really? Actually, there's a couple, going back to the young college boys drowning, there's a couple of times that they've done that as well. I know that, unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the boy himself, but his parents had got a call from him saying, I'm lost, and they'd gone to where he said he was, but they just found the car and not him, and he disappeared. And another boy had phoned his girlfriend and said, I'm by the river, but I've no idea how I got here. And again, in the Manchester drowning cases in England, because it's not just happening in the canals, though, it's also been happening in the rivers around it, around the city. And one boy, he phoned his fiancée and he said, I'm at this pond, but I've no idea how I got here and I'm lost. And then he disappeared and they found him dead. So there's really strange things going on.
Yeah, and it sounds like something's affecting them mentally in some way when they do that. But of course, the fact that they're not being found is thoroughly mysterious.
Yeah, and strangely, when I was after I'd finished this book and doing the research for the new one, I came across something that a man had written an awful lot about a theory called subliminal distraction theory, and it's something that I'd never heard of. But the reason I found it was because he was tying it in with some of the college boy drowning deaths and also some of the people missing in national parks. And his wife had actually suffered from it, and it sounds unrelated when I start to talk about it, but it's something that happened back in the 60s when offices were first established and people started working more and more in offices. The engineers were asked to develop cubicles. I don't know if they're used as much now, but people used to sit in cubicles with the front of it and the sides blocked off so that you couldn't really see people around you. And the reason they developed it was because they said that the medical profession had noticed a lot of people were having breakdowns in offices. Now, that could just be having to work in an office, but, they were saying that the reason is that our brain detects threat. So it's the same as if somebody is playing computer games all day. So they're sitting at their desk and they're on the computer. But if they're in an office which is busy, or they're in a college dorm which is busy, and people are constantly walking past you, but they're coming from behind, so you're seeing them out of the corner of your eye and they're walking past, and your brain detects that as a threat, almost going back to the sort of caveman days, I suppose, when you would see predators coming towards you. So you think it's a threat, but because obviously you're in an office or you're at home on a computer game, you know it's not a threat, it's your friend or it's somebody you know walking past. But your brain doesn't understand that, so you constantly block that threat and you deny it. But it gets to a point that it builds up and you suddenly just have this breakdown. So it can involve things like actually just going out to the middle of the street, taking all your clothes off, walking off and killing yourself. And the reason I discovered it, I mean, I'm not saying I sort of understand it or believe it, but it is a theory. And the reason I came across it was because they were saying that, college people get very stressed when it comes to exam times. They're studying constantly. They're in libraries, or people who play on computer games all the time. But, whether that relates to people who have gone for a hike, I don't know. I don't know.
Huh.
But that could be something that causes people to have a breakdown, But I kind of was looking at all different angles, and I was thinking it was the environment that could be causing it. It could be the demonic causing it, or it could be this psychotronic weapon, which again sounds extreme. But there's a guy called Alfred Weber who's an exopolitics man, and he was a Yale professor. And he has said, come out and said, actually, thousands of people have been used by, it's been developed by time travel technology, Tesla-based, and it's been weaponized. And thousands of people have been used in experiments, testing, to see how we can use these psychotronic weapons. And there's a man called Garland at a London institute, and he was talking about these weapons. I mean, directed energy weapons, sound beams, lasers, they can all be used, can't they? They can be used for crowd control. There's numerous patents. I was looking at Cornell University, and it's got a ream of patents of all these different types of weapons that you can use. If you use really low frequency, a sound weapon, it can induce fear, paranoia, disorientation.
Right.
I think if you use a high one, it can actually cause rupture of your organs.
Yep.
So I don't know.
Well, I think the time period that some of these things have been going on, though, kind of like some of the cases now might be that, but some of the old ones obviously are beyond where we even had a country here. But
yeah.
Besides that, personally, I tend to look for the more natural explanation, because at least we know there are natural environmental factors that can affect us.
Mm-hmm.
I think anytime we jump to any of the other theories, and it may end up being one of those, if you say, well, it's aliens, well, we don't know for sure that aliens exist. We know there's a UFO phenomena, but we can't say with any definite proof what it is. The same with dealing with, a demonic entity. We have a concept and a theory of it, but we have no absolute proof that these things have an empirical existence to us.
Yeah. But I mean, it's also the same with, there's a lot of, stories about people being taken by fairies.
Yeah.
which again sounds ridiculous. But if you look at all the ancient texts, there were a lot of, surprisingly, there were a lot of religious figures that were carrying out studies back in the 1800s, and they would go around the country and collect accounts of people who said that they'd been taken into some other strange dimension.
Yep.
And there were pamphlets. In those days, they used to produce pamphlets and distribute them as opposed to books. And there was one called The Droll's Tradition, and it was a pamphlet. And in it, he'd collected an account of a little boy who said that he'd been in the woods on his own. He was only about 4 years old, and he'd heard this really lovely music coming from the woods, and he thought, well, I know I shouldn't go in there, but I can't help myself, I'm going to go. And as he went in, he said the leaves and the trees and the plants were separating in front of him as though something invisible was separating it out, and it led him in. And then when he got there, there was this beautiful city, and it was crystals and beautiful flowers and animals and things. And you know, I mean, he was only a little boy, but then there's adults who have said it as well. And places like the Isle of Man and Ireland and the Celtic kind of beliefs, there's so many stories about people ending up in different dimensions, and they can see the people who are still in this dimension. There's also a place called Inyangani, which is in Zimbabwe, and some government ministers, all at separate times, had been going in hiking, and two of the government ministers were with a small group of friends, and they went and they got lost in the middle of the forest. And the SAR, search and rescue people, came out looking for them, and this minister said, well, we could see the search people. We were shouting, we were waving at them, saying, we're here, you know, come and get us. But they couldn't see them or hear them. So they were as if they were in a different dimension. And there's another place in Romania, in the Carpathian Mountains, where people go, and they feel as though they've been thrown from one place to the next, and they get lost for a couple of days. When they come back, they're not hungry, they're not thirsty, they can't remember where they've been, but they've got no adverse physical side effects at all. They're absolutely fine. And there, two climbers, actually, there was brothers, and one of them was slightly ahead of the other one. They were hiking, climbing, going up this rock face, and one of the brothers saw this archaic writing, and he went to have a look at it, and the brother said, the next thing I knew, he'd just gone. And he was never found again. And at first they said, well, the brother did it, you know, but there was no evidence. And then they kind of sealed off the area because they had all this ancient writing on, and they needed to discover. And then it was said that they found a tunnel inside, but to get into it, they really had to use advanced technology because they couldn't get through the geomagnetic force. And when they got inside, they found skeletons of giants and ancient civilization. So, you know, there's all kind of strange stories about dimensions and time slips and things, which...
Oh, sure.
Again, you don't know, do you? It's very hard to say.
Yeah, you can't rule any of it out. And what I liked about your book is that you did take on everything from the more down-to-earth explanations out to the really out-there sounding explanations, and presented them all pretty equally.
Yeah, well, I can't say what it is, you know, and I can't dismiss something, but if you investigate it and you research it and you try and corroborate it as much as possible, but you still can't say, yeah, that happened, because you just don't know. And it's always almost as if until something happens to you, you're not really going to believe it until you have a strange experience yourself. And then you might go the route of saying, well, it's always going to be down to this thing because this happened to me. But it's not, because there are so many different possibilities. But they're all worth looking into. But as to the validity of them, it's kind of hard, but you have to go by what you can find. And if there's a lot of evidence, then it proves a good argument. But none of it you can say is conclusive.
Right. Did you ever have anything really bizarre happen to you?
Yeah, I did. Well, I mean, I really haven't had that many experiences myself. The topics just fascinate me, though. But I was staying in an apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I came out of my bedroom. It was about 10 o'clock at night. Came out of my bedroom, and on the right-hand side was another bedroom. On the left-hand side was a bathroom, and the hallway walked towards the living room. And I heard this really, really loud voice, male voice, shouting in my ear. And I thought, what the heck was that? Because there was nobody there. There was only me and one other person in the apartment. They were in the living room. There was nobody in the bedroom. There was nobody anywhere else. It didn't come from outside because it was so loud, it actually hurt my ear. And it was a really aggressive voice. And it was just lasted for a second, and then it stopped. And, I thought, oh, my God, well, I was staying with Native American friends, and I thought, well, maybe they've put a spell on me, or somebody they know, have got a medicine man to put a spell on me for some reason. I'm thinking, well, why would they do that? And then I thought, no, it couldn't have been for me. Maybe it was for the man next door, and they got me by mistake. And, so it was a voice beamed at me, but it wasn't for me. I had to dismiss it, because it was so outlandish, and I couldn't tell them. So I walked down to the living room to my friend, and I said, yeah, I'm going to bed now. Do you think we could leave all the lights on? And they just said, yeah. And they just said, no. And I said, well, the thing is, there's some people outside and they're shouting. It's really rowdy and it's a bit scary. And they just said, oh, don't worry, they'll go away. So I had no choice. So I just went back to my bedroom, and I turned the light out, and I just said, well, come on then, to this imaginary voice, because I thought, if you're going to do something, then just do it, because what can you do? You can't tell anybody because you sound insane, and you just have to say, fine, do what you're going to do, because you can't, But that sounds ridiculous, and I really don't have all these strange and wild experiences to go on. I really don't, and I'm quite glad I don't, but I know that I didn't make it up. I had no reason to, and that's why when you hear people's accounts and they start to tell you, and you think, no, that's just craziness. But I don't know. That's the thing. Until something happens to you, you just don't know.
Yeah, well, that is very, very true. How do you do some of the research for this stuff?
Well, at the moment, actually, I'm getting a lot of accounts sent in to me because I put something in the book saying, if you've had any experiences, please get in touch. And I'm getting some amazing experiences. But, the thing is, it does take a long time to sort of corroborate those. But the amazing thing is that with the internet now, I was looking at Boston Library, and there was a book by an old sea captain in the 1800s. When I was looking at near-death experiences, this was, and you can actually read the book online. So
right.
with the advance, the way things have gone, you can get hold of archived newspapers from 200 years ago. You can get hold of books that are out of print. So a lot of it is online research, but it's amazing how deep you can actually go. So a lot of it is that, but a lot of also, it's contacting people and, experts in their field, and it's contacting and networking and trying to find out things. How to find some of these incidences is really going into archives and looking, and you go from there. And what I tend to do is try and find patterns or try and find links to things and sort of join it up. So, for example, when I was looking at the Eliza Lamb thing with the water tower, and there was a case of the Jamesons family who had gone missing in 2009, and they had, it's quite a long story actually, but it links up to the water tower thing, and that's how I kind of joined it together, because they'd gone missing in the Latimer Mountains. They'd left their home, and this is Oklahoma. It was a father, mother, and daughter, and they'd taken £30,000 with them, and they were looking for a property to buy, but it's quite a remote area. But before they were missing, they had gone to the pastor of the local church and said, the husband had, and said, can I get some bullets to kill a demon? And the pastor sort of said, well, I don't think you can. And he was reading satanic Bibles. And there was a CCTV that they had set up in their home to try and find these spirits that were attacking them, so they said. So anyway, they went missing, and the searchers couldn't find any scent, any footprints, couldn't find any tracks to say where they'd gone, so the trail just went completely cold. But I think that Discovery TV had done a documentary on them, and this source was saying, well, actually, there were scents, and it led to a water tower. The water tower was drained, but they weren't in it. So what they killed in the water tower kept, and then 3 years later, their bodies were found by a hunter, just their skeletons. But then reading further into this, it was suggested by a couple of sources that it happened on what's called the 33rd North Parallel, which in occult world is the line of tragedy. So if something happens, if you do a killing on that line, it's supposed to enhance the power of the occult. So just before the Jamesons went missing, a local vicar, pastor, a lady, was murdered in her church, and the body was put in a ritualistic pose there. So some were saying this could have some kind of occult meaning to it. And years ago, somebody called James Downard, I think he was called, and he came up with this theory about synchronicity and was looking into cryptocracy. I can't say the word, but it's looking into subtle messages given. So they say that, some of these killings, he linked it to JFK, to the Hiroshima bomb. It's a bit out there, again, but it's almost like the elite cabals do these kinds of killings in certain places to enhance the occult power. Now, I don't know whether that's true. I mean, people believe it. I don't know how much there is in that, but I kind of, so I'm looking at water towers and finding a link, and then it leads to something else, and you go off a bit further, and you have to kind of stop at some point, because otherwise you'd go off, you'd just go off forever.
Yeah.
That's the hard bit, knowing when to stop.
The Eliza Lamb thing too.
Yeah.
She was in that water tower for a while, and wasn't some of the water coming out black?
I don't know about black. I know that it was tasting a bit strange, yeah.
Well, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It seems like someone, and people were still drinking it, which just mystifies me. I'm thinking if I took a glass of water and it tasted weird, I'd be like, okay, not drinking that.
It's terrible, isn't it? It's really terrible. Actually, I found a couple of other cases recently where that happened as well. There's one in Malaysia, but I think that was an obvious murder. But there was a couple of other cases like it, but I didn't find anything to tie it into to anything to do with this one. But yeah.
Huh. All right. And there is a chapter in your book where you talk about spirit helpers, as opposed to all the missing people and everything, that the different cases of apparitions appearing to help people out of trouble.
Yeah, I remember reading about those when I was doing the angel books, and there was one case, and where did I find it? This was in one of the old National Geographic type archives, I think. There was a lady called Chantal Lackey, and she'd gone with her boyfriend to this mountain range, and he had grown up around there, and he said, look, I really want to show you this route because it drops down and you can see the ocean. And so they'd gone up to the top of it quite easily, but on the descent, he had chosen quite a route that was almost like a sort of a route that an animal would take down, as opposed to a main trail path down. And so they'd started off descending, and it was quite loose shale, but they'd kind of committed to it, It was a little bit easier to go down than up by that stage, but the rain had started to come, so it was making things slippery, and he was ahead of her, so he just sort of turned around every now and then to make sure she was okay. But when he turned around another time, he just tripped or slipped, and he literally just fell off the cliff to his death. And she just froze in shock. She didn't know what to do. She'd just seen him die in front of her, and she couldn't move. She was just frozen. And she said afterwards, I had no faith, didn't believe in anything really, no God, but I just prayed because I couldn't move. And she said, all of a sudden, it's like the clouds opened up and these angels came and they embraced me and they held me and they got me down. Because the next thing she remembered was being at the bottom of the mountain and going to get the emergency people. When the emergency services came to retrieve him, they said, there's no way that even with our climbing equipment, we would have been able to get down that route safely. We just wouldn't even have attempted it. But, she swore that they helped her down. And there was a British journalist, and he used to go covering for a national newspaper, so he'd be sent to cover stories. And he'd gone to Scotland because in the mountains some Boy Scouts had gone missing, and it was really cold and misty, and they thought, we've got to get them down. So he'd gone there to cover the story, but by the time he arrived there, because it's about an 8-hour journey, they'd been found. So he thought, well, I'll just speak to the boys anyway. And they said to him, well, we were completely lost, but we saw this lady in white, and she was waving at us, saying, come with us, come with me. So they went towards her, and she led them down, and she led them to the search party. And then he spoke to the search party leader, and he said, have you heard this story? What happened, And they said, of course, there was no lady up there, no way. But the boys, swear that this figure, this kind of angel, led them to safety. And they're the nice ones. But there's loads of accounts like that. There's loads of accounts where people are in cars. And one I was reading the other day, and this preacher, he wasn't actually qualified as a preacher, he was just learning, but it was the middle of winter, and he'd promised that he would go and do a talk, but it was actually quite a difficult route up to a mountain area to a local church. But he said, well, I've committed, I'm going to go. But the snow started falling almost immediately, so by the time he got there, they said to him, look, please make your talk quick, because they all need to get home, it's really dangerous. So he did it quickly, and then he was on his way home, and he did a 360 skid, and he ended up pretty much hanging off the cliff, and he just thought, this is it, I'm done. And then he said, I just felt this presence. It was like there was this presence in the car next to me, and he said, I didn't know what to do, so I just said to this presence that I couldn't really see, please just get out the car and lead my car off the edge of this cliff and get me home. And he said, I could see this glow out of the side of the car, and it led me. I got home, and he goes, I know no one's going to believe me, but this is what happened. And there are loads of stories like that, So, again, you can say, well, there's a psychologist, actually, who calls it second-person syndrome, I think it's called, and they say, well, you just imagine it, you just make it up. Because a man called, I think he was called Smythe, and he was climbing up Everest, and all of his companions had given up, but he was not going to give up. He was going to make it up to the top. And he was on his own, and he only had about 200 meters left to go. But because of the altitude, he could hardly breathe, and he thought, I'm going to die. And so he put his hand in his pocket, and he got out his last remaining morsel of food to try and give him some strength. And before he ate it, he broke half of it off, and he gave it to this person who was standing next to him. But when he got back to camp, he thought, well, there wasn't anybody there, and he was writing his journal, and he actually put it in the journal saying, I know people are going to think this is ridiculous, but I shared my biscuit with this person, but there was no person there, but he helped me, and he got me there. So, whether it's your survival mode, imagining something, or I tend to hope that it's an angel.
Now, how do you define angels? Are you defining them from like a Christian context or just a higher power?
Well, I suppose I go with the Christian context, but I mean, to me, I believe in it all, but I don't mind what people's religion. It doesn't matter if it's a different faith, because it's all part of the same good thing. So whether it's an angel from heaven, or whether you define it in a different way, it doesn't matter to me. I try and think, well, maybe it's from heaven. I really believe in heaven, but if it's a higher good power, it doesn't matter, because it's good, intrinsically.
Right.
So it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's there to help you. It's benevolent, and
Okay. How many books do you have out now?
Oh, crikey. Probably about 12, 13, 14. I'd lost count, really. About 14, I think.
When did you put the first one out? What was that?
That was the near-death experiences. It was really just a collection of people's near-death experiences. So all, true stories.
And how long ago was that?
About a year and a half ago.
Wow. So you've written all these in a year and a half?
Well, I mean, I started it all. They took me a long time to do, but I would do one. I kind of tend to be working on one, and then I start working on another one. So I've got 3 or 4 going at the same time. So, yeah, I'd probably started a couple of years before that. I couldn't really decide what ones I was, going to do, but I did that. I did the angel ones, near-death experience, and also afterlife communication ones, which really, really fascinates me. So I kind of did those first, and then I moved on to the more darker kind of ones.
And again, you write under, what's your other pen name?
The other pen name is Tessie Rawlins, which is Rawlins, and then these ones are, even though I'm a woman, they're Stephen Young. because I when I wrote the ones about heaven and angels, I wasn't really sure that people would want to read about demons and ghosts, and because actually some of them are really scary. So I developed two separate identities for those, but.
But there are plenty of people interested in both sides.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there must be. Yeah. The whole thing is fascinating to me. I'm never going to stop researching all of this, because there is just so much to learn. I love to learn about it all.
And you definitely want people sharing their stories with you, correct?
Yeah, that would be great. I've got Facebook. I don't use a website. So I've got Facebook, which is Steph Young Author, or I've got Stephen Young Author at hotmail.com. So they're the best ways probably to get hold of me. But yeah, I love having people's stories.
Okay, all right. And the latest book again, the title of it is what?
Something in the Woods is Taking People.
And when do you think your next one's going to be out?
It's going to be out within 5 to 6 weeks.
Oh, wow, that's soon.
I do 12 hours a day. I'm absolutely addicted. I really do. I do so much work.
And the name of the next one's going to be what?
I don't know. Something like, it's going to be, again, something like Taken in the Woods, something like that. It's going to be related to those other 2 or 3.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
And this is the third part of a trilogy so far, right? What are the other 2 parts?
Mysterious Things in the Woods was the first one, which was kind of a summary of what is out there at the moment. And then I did Something in the Woods, and I also did Predator in the Woods, which is really just mostly about sightings of strange entities. So whether they're shimmering predator-type things, whether they're black shadows, well, there's accounts of translucent human-type figures, there's goat men, there's gargoyles, all these kind of things that people can come across.
Fascinating. All right. Well, I thank you for spending some time with us, and we'll have you back soon because you have a lot of other stuff here to talk about.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been lovely.
So there you go. That was the interview with Steph Young, and I highly recommend checking out her book, Something in the Woods is Taking People, if you found that at all interesting. There's a lot more detail there. Even though it's not a very long book, she definitely packs in a lot of information and makes it very entertaining to read. And you're only looking at about $3 US for the book, so at least the Kindle edition. There's no paperback edition. All right, next week, Peter Robbins, hopefully for real this time. And we're going to take you out with some Psyche Corporation. Here's Nightmares.